Good morning, everyone. We can start this session on digital public sector. We hope that we will keep the momentum of the high-level thinking that we were provided in the first part of the morning and the excitement of the presentation by Peter. My name is Emanuele Baldacci. I work with Digit in the area of e-government and digital services. And it is my pleasure for me to chair this meeting, and I will immediately present who are the actors of the content. Adrian Dusa, who is working also in Digit, is a deputy head of unit working on interoperability. He will be covering the area of interoperability as a key element in designing digital public services. Then we will have Kelly Liljemo, who is a project officer in the Trans-European system sector in Digit. And this is an area that is of a lot of importance for starting to implement some of the generic plug-and-play solutions that we in the Commission are deploying and put it at work in the context of systems that connect the European public administrations. And then Esther Makaay at the end will provide us the ground truth of application of one of the key building blocks, the digital identity, in the context of the Dutch case, and also hopefully tell us a little bit more about what Connectis does, a very interesting facilitating and orchestrating platform for the deployment of digital solutions. The rule of the game is that we will give to the speakers about 10 minutes. We want this to be as interactive as possible, so we will have ample time for you to ask questions, make comments. The overall idea of the session is to present a bit our thinking and some of the lessons learned on designing digital public services which are interoperable by design, which are made up of modules, building blocks which are open and reusable, so that we can foster the reuse and share culture within the European institutions, but more generally in the context of digitalizing public administration in Europe. So without further ado, I will start with Adrian, and then we will proceed with Kelly and Esther with short presentations. You can have, at the end of each presentation, clarification questions, but I would ask you to hold your comments and more substantive questions for the end, where we will be taking up in the general discussions, all of them.
Thank you, Emanuele, and thank you, everybody, for coming. Usually I speak quite fast, and just to let you know that now I'm consciously speaking even faster, perhaps, to fit into the 10 minutes that were given for this presentation. I'll skip my introduction. You heard who I am. And what is this about? This is about bringing to you the idea that EIF, which is the European Interoperability Framework, is something that is looming on top of your head. It's something that we are supposed to implement. And I will also deliver some of the solutions that can help you implement the EIF in your work context. So what is EIF? It's a European Interoperability Framework. An update of EIF was adopted last year in March, and that is the third version. So that means we have more than 10 years experience of describing the concepts around interoperability in a way that helps you implement it in practice. It's centered around this conceptual model that of a public service, and what we bring on top of this, and is something that is quite innovative for the interoperability work in general in the public sector, is the 4 layers of interoperability. That is the technical layer about exchanging bits and bytes across systems. Then we have the semantic interoperability, attaching a meaning to the data described by those bits and bytes. Then organization interoperability, which is about setting up exchanges among organizations when it comes to data. And finally, legal interoperability, which is the most complex interoperability. It's about the legal context that can hinder or foster interoperability. We don't deliver this just as it is. We do take a number of principles as the supporting for EIF, and there are 12 of them. You have them on screen. And then we also give you 47 recommendations, so quite a lot of them, which would go through each principle, go through this conceptual model, and help make this concrete in the public sector. Why was I saying that EIF is something that you should care about? Is because last year in October, ministers from all the member states, and actually the EEA countries, so the economic area countries, they got together in Tallinn during the Estonian presidency, and they signed document which is known as the Tallinn Declaration on E-Government, which among other things, so here you have a picture of the signatories, and in that paper they say that the EU institutions are to implement the EIF and the Interoperability Action Plan by the end of 2021. So this is kind of the expectation from the people of Europe represented through their governments that was laid down in Tallinn last year. So with this, what are we doing to help us in the Commission, help all the institutions to implement EIF? We did put together ways of going from the very abstract and sometimes theoretical, which is at the top, which is about the standards and the technical specifications, all the way to delivering services which can be reused and can make the adoption or the implementation of EIF a reality. How we do that, we'll see in the next talk by Kelly on the building blocks and their evolution from a building block to a service. And you have here some examples where, for example, you would have the SAML protocol and language that is used for identity assertions that is then reused in the CEF EID building block, and it instantiated afterwards, in our case, as institutions in the EU login service, or we'll see in the talk of Esther later how that happens. The same concept, the same building bricks that are instantiated in the Dutch case. We are doing more than that here. I will really accelerate, and I leave this as hooks for you to ask questions either during the Q&A or later on, or even from tomorrow on when you want to interact with us. We do have a maturity assessment, both the standard and a service that is available to everybody that can be used either to assess the maturity in terms of interoperability of public service, or for assessment of your portfolio of public services to see the level of maturity of that. And it's a benchmarking exercise, so that means you can go back and establish a strategy or a plan for implementing interoperability based on these assessments. We do have, when we go one layer lower, for each information system or for the implementation of your service, we do have a test bed for interoperability that you can employ in conjunction with your systems during your implementation phase to assess and to test the interoperability of your service. And this is being used in a number of pan-European services that are implemented in DIGIT, in the European Commission, and available to all of us, of course. And we do have a standard way of bringing together the public services in a way that is both reusable in the sense of other people building their catalog of services in the same way, and also reusable in accessing the services. And if you were to think about the data that is underlying the oil of the new economy, this would be the standard way of accessing the data and of driving value of both the data and the services that you implement in your organization. What you see in the slides, and you will have the opportunity to look in closer if you want later, it's also, I'm pointing here, the EIF recommendation that is implemented, or where we cross-reference with this solution from ISA Square. And then we have JoinUp that evolved over the years from we had the ePractice.eu and the OZOR, so both let's say the theoretical knowledge about interoperability and the open source implementation repository that was there, and federating also with member state repositories and so on and so forth. This evolved in JoinUp, and since last year there is a new version of it, a new implementation of it, that again helps you to find back solutions that other people built for the same problem that you are facing, or to share your experience with the community, and build communities around solutions. And here the point, it kind of wraps up into the solutions that we offer to you, and there are many more than that. We have about 50 actions into the ISA Square program, and all of those contribute back to the EIF implementation. But I'm pointing out to the National Interoperability Framework Observatory, which is a tool that we built towards the member states and looking at the level of implementation of EIF in the member states, but the same process, the same way of measuring the EIF implementation and looking back at how to improve this percentage can be employed also towards the institutions. Thank you very much. This was it.
Thank you, Adrian. Let me ask if there is any specific question for clarification at this point for Adrian. Something in the presentation was not clear. Otherwise, we can come back to that in the Q&A part. Doesn't seem to be the case. So thanks, Adrian. And now it's Kelly's turn on systems to exchange securely data and information in the European Union. Kelly.
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you for coming. It was a bit of a journey I found to find this room, so well done. I will be talking about secure data exchange in the EU, and obviously the first thing that comes to mind when you talk about data exchange is football. So when playing football, if you are, let's say, a Belgian team playing a game, this team can play against another team, not only in Belgium, but in other countries. Actually, teams all over the world are able to play against each other because everyone follows the same rules. And this is, in fact, what we are trying to make happen here. It's about promoting the use of the same common standards and specifications across Europe and beyond in order to level the playing field, to make sure that everybody can exchange data with each other. So how are we doing that? Well, through different EU programs, so ISA Square and CEF, the Commission is investing in the adoption of those standards, and the Commission is also leading by example by using those same standards. So if we look at those two aspects, starting with how we are investing through these different EU programs, well, basically it is all about these standards and specifications. So how are we making sure they are adopted? Well, there is a set of services around them. This is what Adrian just mentioned and called building blocks to make it easier for member states and institutions to use them. So it's about communication, raising awareness, and doing different webinars and training sessions. It's about providing different services such as test services. It's about even grant funding is available to cover the costs. And there is sample software obviously available, but also the market is picking up. More and more vendors, software vendors, are natively supporting those same common standards. So using their software, you are also automatically able to exchange data seamlessly. And well, is it working is the question perhaps. And if you look at this slide, you see that it's moving up, so that's a good direction. I don't know if you can see, but 2014 Q4, all the way at the left, and then you have 2018 Q1 here on the right. So it's moving rather quickly. They are being taken up. And when we start looking at these projects that are using these same common standards, they are often large pan-European projects. And more often than not, the EU institutions, policy DGs, agencies, and institutions are involved in the exchange of data with the member states. And this is where we move into leading by example. And in the case where institutions are using those standards and specifications, there is another option of making it even easier. And this is what Adrian mentioned, moving to a service layer, managed service. We are providing a layer of hosting, SLAs, and operational teams that provide those standards as a service towards the institutions and agencies. And why is that a good idea? Well, it saves time. It's already up and running. It's sort of just connecting to it. It saves money, obviously. We don't have to host the same applications over and over again. And, well, it makes it easier for the users. So any data can be exchanged. This is not about the different policy areas. This allows the DGs and the institutions to focus on their area of business while the secure exchange is taken care of by specialized teams. and any type of data can be exchanged, and machine-to-machine or human interaction. So basically the message here is, if you do need to exchange data securely, there is no need to reinvent the wheel. There are agreed standards and specifications out there. Use those, and yeah, come see us. We will make it easier for you, sort of take your pain away. It's a big promise. I realize that. We have good teams, I hope. We also have booths downstairs, so ISA Square, you will find them in number 5, I think, and CEF building blocks, you will find them in spot 8. So come and talk to us.
Very good. Thanks so much. Kelly, again, if there is at this point any clarification, specific question for Kelly? Okay, doesn't seem to be the case, so thanks so much. And we move to Esther, and maybe Esther, you can start by telling us a bit what Connectis does.
I get to that in my presentation. Yeah. I'm going to ask this question, and last time I did it at some other conference as well. So, who in the audience isn't a Belgian citizen? Okay, quite a lot. And how many of you did have to apply for a Belgian passport in order to be here today? No one. Okay, this seems like a stupid question, right? But online, in the digital world, this is exactly what we're doing today. If you would go to the Netherlands and you're not Dutch, and you want to interact online with our government, we kindly request you to go for a DigiD. And it's not that funny. And I talked to someone from the building blocks earlier today, and she said, during my career, I've lived in 5 European countries. I've now got 5 national credentials. Some of them I don't use anymore, but I still have them, I need them. So this is what eIDAS basically is trying to solve. It will allow you to bring your own national identity across borders in Europe and use it just like you do at home, just like you would use your passport abroad. So this is me. eIDAS has been around since 2014, and it's about creating a predictable regulatory environment. It's got 2 parts of that. It's got the electronic identification, which came into full force end of September, and it's got the trust services. And I think this predictable regulatory environment sort of is best explained by one of the trust services, which are like signatures and seals and timestamps and all the stuff you do in a notary contractual world offline on paper. For example, a digital signature, eIDAS doesn't really tell you what the validity is of that signature. It does tell you it has the same validity as a handwritten one. And what the legal context is, well, look it up in your own national legislation. That's what it comes down to. And I really like this approach because it allows for national sovereignty while still enabling this digital single market idea. Now, what we did, my company, we opened up about 100 Dutch governmental service providers through eIDAS to other European citizens. And we did this on 2 CEF calls, as we call them, 2 projects that were funded by Connecting Europe facilities. This is my company. This is what we do in everyday life. On the left, you get this typical situation of service providers, which can be private or public, that want to allow their customers, users, citizens, to log on to their services or to authenticate against their services. And there's many eIDs that you probably would like to facilitate, but it's a real difficulty to do so if you have to make connections to each and every one of them. And what we offer them is say, okay, you connect to us, and we do the protocol translation. We hook up any identity you'd like and are allowed to let your users use. So, well, we're a private sector company, but all of our shareholders are not-for-profit organizations, so it's a strong social enterprise there. Looking at our solution and eIDAS, this is what I'd like to show you. This is how it works. You've got the European users, and they're connected to the service providers, which in our case are in majority municipalities, so they are comparable to SMEs. They're really smaller organizations typically needing to open up their services. But in practice, it's more like this. Because we started, of course, 2 years ago when eIDAS wasn't fully out there. So we had to deal with all different interpretations. We had Stork 2.0 in there, the predecessor of eIDAS. We had middleware proxies. There were some countries that did PKI, X509 certificates. There were custom solutions. Then we had our national governmental interfaces. And of course, especially municipalities, they work with digital forms that needed to be integrated, procedures in back-end systems, e-government services, and they already had their solution partners to work with. So we basically worked through those solution partners with the municipalities, but also all the way up through governments and their digital solutions. So it was really interesting to talk about this with all the parties at the different levels of this project. Some of the lessons learned, I don't have time for all the practical insights that we gained, but come and find me. First and upmost, and this is really my pet project for the future, for the day after tomorrow, eIDAS allows for private sector participation, and this is really crucial. Private sector organizations don't have many options, and business-to-business fraud is rising. So even though the public sector is still not connected fully yet, private sector also needs to follow. And how are we going to facilitate that? Because there's all sorts of different business cases involved. Something that is really troubling public sector is that national citizen identifiers, citizen registration numbers are heavily regulated. And so they're not in the cross-border authentication. There is a unique identifier there, but how do we deal with someone that doesn't have that citizen registration number? Well, there's work being done there. There's some really cool solutions doing account linking or figuring out who this person is based on the attributes that you do get. But there's also countries working on mapping any existing registration numbers to these eIDAS accounts, helping public organizations to facilitate their services. Well, if you are used as an organization to accept a local eID or having your own user management account system, then starting to accept eIDs that are from another organization is really challenging. How do I know that this person called Esther Makaay is the same as this person called Esther Makaay? I think in Germany there's 9,000 Hans Müllers. Some of them are bound to have the same date of birth. How do I know who am I talking to here? There's also solutions around this, but it's challenging. Now, eIDAS is about more than authentication. We've seen a lot of interesting use cases popping up based on digital signatures or digital certificates. Many of the trust services, like the certificates, also contain identifying information and can make contracts and agreements legally binding. There was a great use case in the Netherlands where a party who deals with invoices for healthcare is now able to do refactoring based on digital signatures in under 7 minutes, where this used to take them 7 days. Another interesting thing is that both persons and organizations can be identified, and the Netherlands has a really strong system for organization identification. Italy has it in their scheme as well. I know Estonia does, and there's many more countries now looking into this. So if, as a government, you want to relate to your organizations, to the businesses, but also for business to business, this can be really interesting. And last but not least, just as the internet doesn't stop at your national borders, it also doesn't stop at the European borders. We need to also be able to think about how we are going to deal with the United States, with Asia, with Russia, with Turkey, with all the other countries around Europe. And luckily, if we have a standard like eIDAS, they don't need to negotiate connections to 27 different member states. But there still is work to be done. So thank you for your time. Thank you for listening to me. And if you have any questions, find me or pick one of these leaflets up and look us up. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther, and thanks for to all our panelists for being brief and to the point and send the main message. So now the time left is really for all of us to have a conversation on either things that you would like to ask directly to the panelists on the specific areas that they've been covering, but also your views, your comments, your lessons learned. And I would start by asking a general question myself to both the panelists and to all of you, and please feel free to, let's say, address it or ask and comment on other areas. My general question is whether this approach that you have been seeing in the different presentations, from having a conceptual model that is the glue for designing interoperable public services, to building these reusable Lego blocks that put together are the elements which create the government service platform. Is this an approach that makes sense to you? Is this an approach that you think it's working? Or do you see, let's say, shortcomings, barriers, things that don't work well, that should be addressed? Even the forum in which we are, a particular emphasis would be on reusing many of these solutions and conceptual frameworks in the context of the systems that we all run, and whether you are happy or dissatisfied with that. So this is just one possible avenue, but before giving the floor to the panelists to have their views, I would like to ask you if you have any comment on this point or more general points that you want to raise. So just raise your hand, and I think we'll have a mic. Yes, there is mics. So who wants to break the ice? Okay. So we'll give you some more time to think, and what I'll do is that I will turn to the panelists first and try to answer my first general question. Maybe we can go in the same order as we spoke. So the question was about whether the general approach makes sense and whether you see the main barriers to, let's say, implementing this approach into reality. And we're talking about an approach that is serving mostly European public administrations, but also the European institutions, and in particular the trans-European systems, which are IT solutions that are connecting Brussels, Luxembourg, and Strasbourg with the respective capitals in the European Union. So, Adrian, your view.
Thank you. I will take this opportunity to do a practical exercise of going through the EIF layers that I just described in my slides. And indeed, the short answer is that it makes a lot of sense to push the reuse at the level of reusing services, because that is the highest level of reuse and enables the by default interoperability and all the goodies and the principles that come along with that. But we should not forget that this is not only about that reusable service. We have to observe interoperability at the level of all the reversed pyramid that I showed in my slides. That means that we have to build in on open specifications and taking care of the standards that are commonly agreed by everybody, to involve everybody in the development of the building blocks. And if I am to take example of what the colleagues are doing in the Trans-European Services Unit, you have all this dimension of specification, implementation, reference implementation in many cases that allows people to either use the code or to get inspired from that, and then ultimately wrapping that up in the MOUs or SLAs that are needed for the setup of the service. So again, observing the EIF and going from the technical implementation to the organizational setup, and finally taking care that the legal context is observed for the proper exchange of the data.
Okay, thanks. Kelly?
Yes, if we look at the two layers from my presentation, so the building block and the managed service, and thinking back about the new tomorrow, what was it in this speech?
The day after tomorrow.
The day after tomorrow, and how to make sure that we can cope. The building block approach, I believe, is the only way that we can scale towards the member states. So the idea of the building blocks is these are the specifications that we will use. We will make sure everybody can talk to everyone. You can go to the market, but we will also help you. If you want, you can use this, the sample software at the Commission, but once there is sufficient maturity, this will become the new normal way of exchanging data. And the Commission or the EU funding can sort of be at least maybe not completely removed perhaps, but at least minimized. And given that the member states are the ones taking ownership here, it scales much quicker. And this is, I believe, why we have a take-up that is happening much quicker than we expected. We were hoping, of course. Now, then providing it as a managed service to us, the institutions, is something that came from working with our partners because before, so currently, if you only look at the building block, an institution and a member state receives exactly the same service. And a lot of institutions are saying, we don't want to host an access point. We don't want to do, we don't have the knowledge, and we don't really want to invest in getting a data center server and deploy this and then maintain it. Why don't you do it for us? And this is why DIGITEC is setting up a managed service to really make it easier for the institutions to be able to participate in this game. So I believe the two dimensions, well, to me at least, they make sense.
Okay. Thanks a lot, and I will come back to the issue of managed services again, asking for your views as well later on, but Esther first.
Yeah, of course, we're one of the beneficiaries of these building blocks. We happily used them, and we were also glad to see that while they're at quite a high level, they're more on a national governmental level, but by having our governments be able to use and reuse this knowledge, these reference implementations, while giving them the freedom to do it their own way, which is very important because, you know, Europe is, as I often call it, 27 unique snowflakes. But they're still able to work together and also facilitate for very specific cultural and technological differences in countries. There's a lot of legacy there. Europe is throwing legislation at us. You need to be compliant. And in this way, you also get some tools to be able to be compliant, and that really is helping. And in our case, the funding also helped us because especially the municipalities wouldn't have opened up to eIDAS as soon as they did now if it weren't for that partial funding that they got in doing so. So that really was a benefit.
Thank you, Esther. And now let me turn back to you in case in the meantime you came up with some comments or questions before I ask a second round. Please, yes. Can we get a mic?
Yes.
Yes, I think you raised a very important point, which is how to address the legacy of all our systems in the member states, but even in the institution. So I see clear benefits for new systems. I see clear benefits for having horizontal security services or requirements addressed in these building blocks in a common way. But how can we transition our legacy systems using building blocks? Are you providing support services to manage this transition?
Okay, so I guess this was a question to Kelly, but I will also ask the other panelists if they want to more generally address it. So issue is building blocks are nice, they're good, innovative, they are secure by design, interoperable, but how do we make sure that we are able to insert these Lego blocks in a machinery which is old, it's non-interoperable, and it has not the nice characteristics that we would have without stopping the engine, because that's typically the case in any transition. So, Kelly.
Indeed. So how to transfer from legacy to this new way of working? Indeed, when onboarding these large projects, we have two types of projects, and we make a difference between them. One of them is the ones that don't have a solution yet and that want to enable digital exchange. Until now it's been paper-based or sending DVDs or other, using UPS. And it's rather more straightforward, if you will, because it's about digitizing their way. And then there is the other type, which already has a way of working and that needs to upgrade. And in both cases, the Connecting Europe facility helps with funding, but has also prepared different, we call them blueprints, that allow us to help, and we do kind of assist and work together with the projects to analyze the as-is, to understand the effort required to move from as-is to the to-be, and how this transition can happen over time.
Can I?
Yeah, please.
Can I add some personal experience here? What I saw, especially with municipalities in the Netherlands, because they were used to offering digital services for a number of years, but they only had one access solution. So what happened was that their complete internal systems, their whole back-end systems, were really tailored to this one solution. And we came in and told them there's going to be other stuff happening. It hurts, big time. I really had to coach them through it. But the thing is, what I noticed is that once you start doing that, once you start taking into account new options, moving away from your single perspective solution that you had, you also open up for new future possibilities. So once they did this, they changed also in their approach. So they were able to also accept other identities, other integrations, and they were even advocating it to other municipalities and other departments, like this is how you do it. They start helping each other. But the first time hurts like hell. It's not much fun.
Adrian?
I can also bring in the angle, moving a bit along the lines that Kelly and Esther proposed. So not really answering your question on how you take the legacy and put the building blocks inside, but just telling that the tool that, the service that I had mentioned earlier, which is about the interoperability maturity assessment, this is definitely a step in that direction. Because being aware, it's a very good approximation of the solution sometimes. You can map your portfolio or take one single service and look at where it is on the interoperability maturity ladder. And just something that I didn't touch on in the presentation, but it's useful to know. We observed a very strong correlation between the level of interoperability that we observe in the member states as measured in our NIFO tool that I described, and the level of digitization of public services that is measured in the DESI indicator. So taking this two, although I'm going into uncharted territory with these correlations and approximations, but you get an idea of how this can help you in assessing the level of maturity of your service and where you should, where the pain is that you can alleviate by adopting a building block or a reusable service in your solution.
Thank you. Please.
A follow-on question to that is, how are you actually trying to onboard business owners, system owners within the institutions? Because the focus in the first years has really been towards the member states. We've heard about leading by example, but I can tell you in practice, this is for many system business owners still uncharted domain. So how would people become aware of how this can be useful for their systems? And how will you help out in getting that evolution?
Thank you. That's a good question. I steal the stage to Kelly for a second and tell you, and then I will let everyone else answer. But I really like the reference you made of walking the talk. And I think that this is much more than common sense, which we learned just half an hour ago is very important, and we should be, let's say, nurturing it even more in our decision processes. It's also embedded in our commitment as European institutions and the European Commission in particular in the e-government action plan and the Tallinn Declaration, where we are taking on us the responsibility of implementing the nice features of these generic solutions in our systems. And this is for a very practical reason, and this is why I wanted to steal for a moment the mic from Kelly and the other panelists. Because I mentioned already several times trans-European systems, and I was recently in Copenhagen for a meeting with Nordic countries, and one of the participants, one of the colleagues from the member states made a very important point. He said, if you continue to, let's say you're talking about interoperability and deploying these horizontal platforms and you want to help us do the same in the member states, so moving across the different silos, combining the different domains so that there is not, let's say, barriers to interoperability, to principles like once only. At the same time, if you are replicating legacy technologies in the trans-European systems, which are systems that are, again, typically designed by domain, you are basically making our life in the countries much harder, because we need to face technology environments which are in a way dictated or promoted or just inherited from the interactions between the European Commission, in that case, and member states, and that are embedding, let's say, technology constraints which do not make these horizontal cross-cutting layers available. So it is definitely very important that we are taking a very holistic approach and that we start from our system. And by our system, I mean not only the European Commission ones, but also that we collaborate more generally with the European institutions. As you may know, there is a committee called Comité Informatique Interinstitutionnel, pardon my French, and this committee is the steering group that promotes the reuse of solutions across different institutions. And I'm very much aware, and probably you are even more aware than me, that this is still not fully satisfactory and there are still gaps. But definitely, and I take the message in your question, this is the way to go. And this is where we, particularly the IT department in the Commission, are very much behind this, trying to support colleagues in the IT departments of the other institutions in, again, deploying generic solutions which would support the interoperability across the institutions. Not so much and not only because this will make our life in this group easier, but because, as I mentioned before, this has implications for member states as well. So we can be promoting a different level and a different model of digital public services in Europe, in fact, starting from our work. And in the context of the assessment of the e-government action plan and Tallinn Declaration principle implementation, we proceeded to review the actions that we committed to, and we kept track of where we were making progress and where not, and let's say the glass is, I think, half full or half empty as usual. But Kelly and others, you want to jump in and say something?
Yes. Well, in the context of the building blocks or data exchange in particular, if we look at the projects that are using, and we have been targeting the member states heavily. Most often the Commission or an EU institution or an agency is involved. So if we take an example of tobacco reporting, where the tobacco industry has to report about the ingredients of tobacco products to DG Santé, we have the decision-making process in the legislative area where SecGen interconnects with the Parliament and also the national parliaments. We have e-procurement, where the member states are using these networks to send their invoices and orders to public administrations in member states, but also the European Commission, etc., etc. So there is typically always an institution involved. And how are we interacting with the member states in the promotion of this? It's through the policy DG or the agency or the institution. And later today, actually, we will have a presentation about the Council, how they are implementing also data exchange and eDelivery in their exchange with the member states. I think it's 255 or something. So it's not that the institutions are not involved, but indeed the focus has been on these projects where the member states are involved. So the use between the institutions themselves only is rather limited, and here we could do a lot more. We've had some interactions with HR, for example, where colleagues moving from one institution to the other, the medical file is actually printed, stamped, and then on the other side is scanned and entered into the system. Well, we could simply send it securely from one institution's medical service to the other one and save a lot of time and effort. So there are a lot of use cases where we are in conversation with, but there is also a lot of unknown areas where there is a need and we are not yet there. Yeah.
Thank you, Kelly. Adrian or Esther, do you want to comment on this or
I'm
experience?
I'm typically from a more business perspective, so institutions to me are a bit of a gray area. If anyone wants to talk to me about institutions, come and find me. But I'm
Okay, I will take a bit the point of Kelly further, and what I want to stress in this intervention is that there is value in the fact that DigiConnect and Trusted Digit, with the implementation of the building blocks for the Connecting Europe facility, there is value in the way that eIDAS Square program is funding the actions and having commission services that are active in their policy fields for development of the eIDAS solutions. And the value is that there is this exchange, this dynamic where we take the examples that Kelly just made, where we were active with the member states in digitalizing their processes with building blocks and getting them implemented there, and then going and taking that experience into the institutions or context and implementing digitalization of those processes. And just to give another example I spoke about DIF, that is one of the concepts that guide our work in the eIDAS Square program and the overall interoperability policy. But we do have something which is called European Interoperability Cartography, which is about identifying the constructs, the systems, the pieces of processes that would help implementation of interoperable solutions at EU level, both cross-border and indeed cross-policy, to make sure that we don't build additional barriers for the member states in their efforts. So we have this cartography, but what do we do inside the Commission? I mean, it's like that cartography, it's lost somewhere in a drawer. We're trying not to, of course, and we are aware of that. And then what do we start up? We used to have what we call the Trans-European System Strategy, and that is instantiated in our Reusable Solutions platform, which is taking all the lessons learned from the deployment of the building blocks in the member states and in those solutions, and identifying which are the managed services that will make the most impact in our context by wrapping a building block into the SLA and whatever layers you need to set up, organizational and with the other institutions, for making that a service. And this is what we are doing now around the data exchange, and I believe it's really a point, given that the focus on data everywhere. I think it's something that it's worthwhile.
Thank you, Adrian. And you heard this morning Commissioner Gabriel that she mentioned the immediately future approval of the European Commission digital strategy, which will basically formalize these commitments in terms of including the walk in the talk message and the idea of a reusable solution platform, which is in fact a horizontal layer that will be populated by these building blocks and managed services for the key components of any service platform that will be offered both to European Commission digital solutions, so digital systems, but also European institutions more at large. Okay, more questions or comments? Yes, please, Frederick. Mike?
Works, yes. It's more a reaction than a question. When discussions on the eIDAS regulations started, the first idea that was put on the table, quite naturally, was to say, let's make a European eID. So instead of having interoperability, let's make a European identity card, which seems pretty trivial. And the member states decided not to go that way. They wanted another solution. They wanted a federated model or a distributed model. And that decision is a strong political message. It's an indication of where the society wants to go. And the first reuse that we have to implement is the reuse of that political decision that actually the member states are pushing for federation and not centralization. And there is no fairy tale there. We all have a role to play there. Nobody's going to come and do it for us. So everybody in the room here, we have a role to play to actually first reuse that political message in all the projects that we do. We have to hear that message and make sure that in the architecture that we will build for any trans-European system, we comply with that choice of the society to go for a federated model, in the example of eID. And once we have made that choice on a project, then it raises a couple of technical questions, implementation questions, and this is where the building blocks are actually coming into play. They will bring you answers to these technical questions. But the magical thing where the political message will be re-implemented in the projects will not come from the building blocks. It will come from us here in the room on our projects.
Thank you. Very important comment. And I would say from us in the room and more largely from business requirements, because this is what should drive the design of the services. All right. More comments or questions for the panel? If not, I will ask the $1 million or euros question to our friends here on my right to help me think about the future, given that... Ah, yeah, there's one question.
It's more a question for Esther, who mentioned in her presentation that some member states, I think Netherlands and Italy, are trying to establish the eID concept at the level of the organizations, the legal entities. Is there any political initiative to work on that at European level, or is it more independent member states initiatives, and how many of the member states are looking at that?
Well, as your previous commenter said, you should approach this as a federation. So it's a member state specific thing. Please also remember that something like the Chamber of Commerce, in most Western European countries, this is a political institution, but not in all countries in the world. In some countries it emerged like some yellow pages, private thing. In some countries there's more than one registration office. So this is really, and it's bound heavily into national law and regulation. Well, last week I got this question like, Germany is really interested in our system, can we sell it to them? I'm like, okay, who is Germany in this case? What do they want to know? But it's really adamant that you have a good way of identifying your organization. And again, this is tied into national legislation. Also the accountabilities, the liabilities, the responsibilities involved. Because what people tend to forget is an organization is an entity, but it's always represented by persons. So underneath an organizational identity, there's always personal identification going on high level. So in fact, any organizational identifier should also contain a personal foundation to it. And there's different ways of doing that. The interesting thing about organizational identification is you deal with, how do you call it, proxies and mandates and all sorts of delegations. And this is also where if you venture into the machine-to-machine area, and eDelivery, I know, makes an e-procurement, their standard business reporting stuff is all about machines talking to each other. But if you want to do responsibility, accountability, liability on machine level or IoT level or interface level. You really need to know who is responsible for this machine and this specific behavior. So there's all sorts of delegations going on there that tie back typically to organizational entities, but in the end to persons representing that company. If you don't do this correctly, you're in a big bunch of trouble.
Thank you very much. Yes, the question was precisely in a context where we are doing that for procurement and grant management at the level of the Commission in a centralized way, and linking that to more global initiatives with what could be done in the member states would have been interesting, because we could have saved that validation. Yeah.
I just want to add, like, I need to put on some promotion every time, you know, as you heard, so eIDAS has been around for a while. Since the end of September, there is a certain obligation on the member states to recognize the notified e-identification credentials that were mentioned. But the work is not complete. There is still a lot of room for defining the fringes of the way, and especially this when it comes to the delegation and the representation of legal entities by by physical persons. And this is also where, as a square, we have an action that is on power and mandates that is looking exactly at these challenges, and which is the best standard way of approaching them across Europe. That's end of promotional.
Important to promote and share what we're doing. Okay, more questions or comments? No, while you're thinking more, then I will turn for my $1 million question. And this is more about the future. You have already started touching, but in all the areas for which you were reporting and you're responsible for, my general question is, where do you see the investment in the next 2-3 years? So, for example, what will be the priority, the focus for the future, building new building blocks, implementing the existing one, developing new, facilitating and orchestrating services more globally or more European-wide? And so in all your areas, what is it that will keep you busy in the next 2-3 years? Who do? Yeah? You want to start, Kelly?
Okay.
We go from right to left.
All right. So in the context of CEF, this year just 3 new building blocks were adopted. We already had 5 building blocks since that were adopted in 2014. So those were eID that you heard about, eDelivery that you also heard about, and beyond that we also had e-invoicing, e-signature, and e-translation. E-translation is probably known to you as MT@EC, that now is sort of evolving and growing, and being opened up to the member states administrations as well under CEF. And this year also e-archiving and context broker and big data test infrastructure were added to this pot of building blocks. So we're busy onboarding them into the CEF, let's say, way of working, describing what are the services. If you use a building block, what does that mean? What kind of help do you receive? And what is in scope and what is not? And making sure that all of that is documented, and then we will go and raise awareness and do what we do for the other building blocks. And maybe there to mention just one example, you were asking about eID and challenges. Indeed, eIDAS sort of levels the legal playing field, and there are a lot of other aspects that now that that's sort of sorted, now has to be addressed. Esther can tell you all about the pen points, and I think Frederick also here. I'm not an eID expert, but I do know that we, for example, organized workshops with the member states just to discuss how do we make it known for the users that there is a possibility here to use their national ID. So the user interface, how does it look? Because normally if you are able to use your national ID to log in, you know the logo, let's say, of the national ID. How do you make it known that you can use another nationality for users? Should we have sort of across Europe as a kind of a unified way of making this known? And the member states are discussing this in workshops. And there are a lot of these just practical aspects that need to now be discussed and implemented. And for each building block, there is a set of elements that need to be sorted out and agreed, and it is moving. And now we are also learning about the challenges of e-archiving well, Emanuele is an expert on data already since before, but in our little corner we are now learning about that, so it will be keeping me busy at least.
Thank you. Esther.
Well, coming from the trenches of everyday life, what I foresee in the future is that, in this case, citizens, but this goes for any user or persons, need to be empowered and enabled to really orchestrate their own lives and their own situations. And currently, they aren't empowered because I need to do something, probably because I got a letter from some governmental organization. I need to go to the website, and they tell me how to log on, and then they tell me what they know about me. And this is going to be reversed. And there's two main drivers working here. One is the current rules and legislation that somehow sort of, because the number one question I get from municipalities is, what happens if I don't do this? So I just thought, well, you have to. It's the law. End of discussion. So that really helps in driving this to the future. GDPR also doesn't hurt, and that's the other part, because even though citizens need to have this empowerment, they also need protection and assurance and a certain level of trust. We can't protect them all the way, that would be too much, but having some certain levels of assurance really benefits them in their actions. And then what we're looking at, and this could be another 5 years away, we'll see a tipping point where users are so used to being able to control their own digital lives that if you don't offer this to them, they'll be just baffled, they'll be outraged, they need to be able to get used to that sort of thing, and that will drive the last bit of it.
Thank you. Adrian?
About the next 2-3 years, you might have caught a glimpse in my slides. Next week we are having a conference, the eIDAS Square Midterm Conference, and that is the point where we are taking stock of what the eIDAS Square program did since it started in 2016, and how do we need to tweak that to take the lessons learned on board to make sure that we make the most of the next period until the end of 2020 for the eIDAS Square program. So this is the very concise answer on the next 2-3 years. And then what we expect to do, we expect to do more of the good things that we did before, where we are looking at European legislation context and take the upcoming ideas and nurture them into full-fledged solutions. I can mention here the single digital gateway that was referenced before, and is expected to have a big impact, and we are looking at the horizon of the next 5 years for implementation across Europe, where it will make a big difference for the citizen and their interactions with public administrations in whichever country they are. So this is for the next 2-3 years, and then beyond that, as it was adopted in the proposal of the Commission just before the summer, the eIDAS Square would evolve into the context, the bigger context that is given by the Digital Europe program, and we'll also use this next period to define how will we land into Digital Europe and how we'll continue from Digital Europe to serve even better the deployment of interoperable solutions in Europe and the digitalization of public administrations.
Thank you, Adrian. Last opportunity for you to raise a point for Kelly first. So you can think about your last opportunity for a minute more.
I'm learning from Adrian that we should promote. So on the 7th of December, we're organizing an event which we call a launch event for the new building blocks. So if you are interested in learning about those, join us there. And then also maybe to mention...
Will it be a physical event or web streaming as well?
It will be a physical event in the Bredel building, in the auditorium there. 170 seats. We already have a lot of registered, so you need to hurry if you want to have a seat. Also, just to mention that the eIDAS, of course, is not only eID, it also covers the other side, which we call trust services. So the eDelivery and the e-signature are also, let's say, covered under eIDAS, and their postal service, registered mail under postal services now is also covered under eIDAS, which means that if you do use eDelivery, you're compliant, if you will, to this legislation as well.
Okay, thanks. Esther, do you have any commercial announcement too? for the sake of balance between everyone?
No, but I don't think there's always this commercial governmental distinction, but I mean, we help these governmental services do stuff, and one of my, like I said in my presentation, once we get this show really on the move in Europe with the member states and citizens using this for e-government services, there's private sector on the lure, and they want access to this system because they don't have any other real trustworthy opportunity. So we really need to think about how to work together, and even closer to home, look in your own country. There's a lot of organizations and services that are somewhat in this in-between area. They're not public services, they're not really private services. We're talking about health care, insurance, pensions. We need to facilitate those. This is something that's important to all of us, even you in your private life. So, yeah.
Very good. So, any more questions, doubts about the future, challenges that you see? All right, so I think we are ready to wrap it up. No announcement from my side. I think we have exhausted the short-term announcement, but just as a kind of conclusion to lead us into lunch, I think that these issues will stay with us, and obviously the approach that we have been taking in developing interoperable, reusable solutions, it's clearly an important approach, but the take-up and implementation is even more important. We need to spend equally enough time on making sure that there are sufficient incentive for public and private actors to take up the solutions. We need to go and spend time, talk to the countries, facilitate their work in the country environment on reusing these generic solutions. And then again, I use the expression of our colleague, we need to walk the talk ourselves, because if we have good successful stories to tell, this is the best business card for any, let's say, much better than any sexy presentation that we could make in any conference.